Well, here's the proof, interplanetary climate change, which is NASA's hottest secret. Now, we can look through and find the smoking gun of all 2012 scholarship because we can look at all the planets and the sun and see changes just like we see on Earth. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that. This is a composite graph of solar activity based on core samples from the Antarctic and the Arctic. And what you're seeing is the total amount of sunspot activity. This is what it's been doing in the last few years. We are now at a point where the only time the solar activity was higher than it was right now just so conveniently happens to be 11,000 years ago, which in ancient teaching is associated with what? What happened 11,000 years ago? Atlantis fell, right? Could that be related to the solar activity? Hell yeah. So we're now at the strongest point in 8,000 years since that happened. Mercury has grown a magnetic field when MESSENGER went by in 2008 that was not seen in the 70s with Mariner 10. That's a big change in Mercury. Venus has had a 2,500% increase in this green glow on the night side that you can see there. That's active oxygen. So the atmosphere of Venus is changing back into something that's breathable. Mars is growing clouds and ozone, as you can see right here. There were no clouds on Mars before. That's brand new. The polar ice caps are melting on Mars, and they're actually calling it global warming in the mainstream media. But there's no SUVs on Mars, not that I've ever seen. Jupiter is having these white ovals that were disappearing between 97 and 2000, 3 of them, and then they all meld into one. And this scientist, Dr. Philip Marcus, believed it would cause Jupiter to warm by 18 degrees in only 10 years. Now, if that happened on Earth, what would happen to all life on Earth as we know it? Toast. It's toast. So there's a massive global warming going on with Jupiter. That was the prediction based on what would happen in 2000. That's about the time he did this prediction. He said 10 years. Look at what happens 8 years later. Jupiter is having raging thunderstorms and global upheaval. Towering storms more than 100 kilometers tall. The rare storms, a sign of recent turmoil on the planet. And here's the picture. These bright hotspots were never seen before. This is extra heat that shouldn't be there, and the colors of the rings are changing. Then you go out to Saturn, you're seeing this plasma torus that's grown. All this red area wasn't there before. That's all this charged energy coming from the sun. Jupiter also has one around it, which I just didn't have time to show you in this presentation because we had to shorten it. You're seeing massive X-rays coming out from near the equator of Saturn. That's also a new phenomenon. Again, you're seeing a hotspot, just like the one I just showed you on Jupiter, the raging storms, the global upheaval in 2008. Same thing happened in 2004. Where the heck did all this energy come from? The planet just goes, energy comes out. It's amazing. Uranus, as of 1986, looked like green pea soup with hardly any peas, just the green part. Nothing to see. It's just very flat. Now, this is false color, so that's why this is brighter than this. We're not so much concerned about the color, we're concerned about these little guys, because that's what we didn't see before. These are huge storms. Now remember also, Voyager 2 swept by Uranus, so it saw the whole planet. It didn't just see the side that we see. So even with a satellite going past, we're now seeing all these storms that were not there before. And you're starting to see that happen. It was called featureless as a cue ball, but now Eric Karkoschka is saying, really big changes. Now this is more typical of NASA, when NASA says, ground-based observations show seasonal brightness changes, not well understood. Oh, moving on. They try to downplay this stuff. But this is interplanetary climate change. This is something that's happening to every planet. And all they do is they tell you that it's based on the tilt angle of the axis to the sun. The sun is heating it up because the pole is tilting or because the equator is tilting. And whatever the planet is doing, they just alter it for that planet and say, oh, well, it's got to be caused by the tilt angle of the planet relative to the center of the sun. Not so. Neptune, 1989, relatively few bright clouds. But between 96 and 2002, there's a 40% increase in brightness in the near-infrared range. This is very significant because, obviously, this could not be caused by anything we normally understand. And it's the same thing that's happening throughout the rest of the solar system. It's all doing the same stuff. What you're going to see now is a description, a visual description of how it's been changing. So check this out. You watch down here, you can start to see how it grows over just 6 years. So that's phenomenal. I mean, that's like turning on a lampshade and having light suddenly burst out of the planet that wasn't there before. The near-infrared range is not visible to the eye, but it's just above the visible level. So it's within the spectrum of what can be seen if you had the right eye to see it. So you can do that with a camera, you just can't do it with the naked eye. Now, Pluto is experiencing global warming even though it's moving away from the sun. There's been a 300% increase in its overall atmospheric pressure. This whole system tells us that Earth changes are not unique to the Earth. They're happening everywhere in the solar system. But even on Earth, we're seeing things that are not attributable to the ordinary climate change that we would think of as being caused by SUVs. Volcanic activity since 1875 has gone up by over 500%. Sea level is increasing, temperature is increasing, tornado activity is increasing, natural disasters are increasing, the inflation-adjusted economic losses are increasing. Here you see the red indicates how much heat there is at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, on the floor of the ocean. And then what you're seeing is 85 and 96, or 99 rather. So in 14 years, we see a substantial warming on the bottom of the ocean. Now guess how the scientists explain this? Well, of course, the sun is warming the top of the ocean. And then those warm particles just start sinking down, 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 which is what they're going to do, right? And they sink to the bottom, and they warm up the bottom of the, oh, that's got to be what it is. They warm up the bottom of the ocean, they sink down. So the next time you ever want to boil up some hot dogs, just get a hairdryer and it works great. Why wouldn't you do it that way? You'd probably take 3 hours to boil. It's ridiculous. Heat rises. That's the first, one of the most basic laws of thermodynamics that we all know. But not here. Something's happening inside the Earth. Well, just as we were talking about climate change in the solar system, we now have a change in this presentation. My microphone started malfunctioning at that point in the talk, and so what we've done is to move this shoot here to Joshua Tree, California. And why I'm here is for historical reasons as well. You've just seen how every planet in the solar system is changing in ways that we can distinctly measure. We're seeing brightness changes. We're seeing greater magnetic field strength. We're seeing cataclysmic activity. We're seeing lots of protons and charged particles in the atmospheres. Well, believe it or not, in the early 1950s, UFO contact started occurring here in Joshua Tree with the guys we call the three Georges, George Adamski, George Van Tassel, and George Hunt Williamson. And so what they ended up discovering was an ability to maintain open contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. And that open contact led to prophecies which talked about the idea that the solar system would be changing in measurable ways, just as we're now seeing. But more importantly, these prophecies from the early 1950s clearly established that with these changes in the solar system, there would also be changes in human DNA that would literally correspond to an evolution of the human species as we now know it. This is the working nature of the prophecies of ascension, soul transmutation, and so forth that have been going on for so many thousands of years. We now actually have hard evidence from written prophecies that were published in books in the 1950s that you can go find on your own, showing us, in fact, that these climate changes that I've just described are nothing new. They were known about long ago, and it's all part of this spontaneous evolution that humanity is being led through at this time. So if these prophecies from the 1950s actually have a factual basis, then the interplanetary climate change is not simply going to be something that's making planets brighter, hotter, and more magnetic. It's going to be something that actually changes life as well. Now think about what temperature increase really means. If planets are getting hotter, that means the molecules are vibrating faster. That means there's some sort of increase in frequency going on. So if those changes are being caused by an energetic field, and that energetic field is related to consciousness, then would this mean that the planet is experiencing a rise in its consciousness? That is exactly what I'm suggesting. But in order to make that transition into a new model of biology, we have to first re-examine all of the assumptions that we've made about biological life being something that is randomly evolved only on this planet in the typical model put forth by Charles Darwin, hence called the Darwinian model of evolution. I don't like the Darwinian model of evolution because, frankly, it doesn't even work. If you start looking at examples of bacteria that we see right here around us right now, we know that there's bacteria that's been found in ice from the Antarctic, there's bacteria that have been found inside volcanoes, inside nuclear reactors, and even far out in the cold depths of space. Some bacteria from the Antarctic have been revived after being frozen for 10 million years. And as you go even further, you can see that other bacteria down at the bottom of the Black Sea are able to photosynthesize, meaning that they create their own food energy from the sun, even though it's almost pitch black down there. That's a very unusual condition that suggests that they were made to be in that area. How are they able to do that? Others can thrive on nuclear radiation or even infrared light, which is basically just heat. So when you start seeing these bacteria that are inside volcanoes, in sediments miles below the ocean floor, you have to ask yourself the basic question: did they all originate from other living bacteria? Or is the field itself trying to create life wherever and however it can? Are bacteria simply the product of an intelligent energy that is all throughout the cosmos and has decided to make life the way that it is? Could it be that our galaxy has a personality, and the personality of the galaxy has created a template in which all life emerges from an energetic background? If you look at the work of Dr. Chandra Wickrama Singh, he found that the organic material that comes off of comets is biological in nature. In other words, comet dust has bacteria in it. Well, many people don't even know that this has been discovered, and yet it's a common aspect of this type of physics. Since there's billions of comets in the solar system alone, this suggests that life on Earth may have come here from comet dust, or comets that crashed into the Earth. Dr. Wickrama Singh calls this the panspermia theory. But it's not a theory that I particularly agree with because, again, you're basically saying that life on Earth did not come from here, it came from space. Therefore, somehow it would have still had to have evolved in space. You haven't ruled out Darwinian evolution. You still have the potential that life could have been a random mutation. Again, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that life itself evolved from a field, and the field knows what it wants. So when you're dealing with the chicken or the egg paradox, the answer is it's the chicken and it's the egg, because the chicken and the egg exist together as a template in the field, both of which are ready to spontaneously emerge when the time is right. So believe it or not, I first read a book about Dr. Francis Crick's discoveries that DNA was too complex to have evolved randomly when I was in 5th grade. A friend of mine showed me that book that he'd found in the children's section of the library. Now, I find it fascinating that mainstream science and the mainstream media has known about this ever since the early 1980s, which is when I found out about it. And yet, in all that time, we never hear it discussed that the actual founder of DNA himself, one of the two fathers of all the science that led to us discovering that DNA even exists, is on the public record saying that it's way too complex to have evolved by random chance. It's as if the entire Encyclopedia Britannica fell out of the sky one word at a time, and all those words happened to fall in such a way that they arranged together to make every sentence and every paragraph and every page of the entire encyclopedia. So then you have people that say, well, if you're intelligent design supporter, then that means that you only believe in the Bible, that God created the world 7,000 years ago, and that man and dinosaurs, if there were even dinosaurs, would have had to exist on the Earth at the same time. Or you're on the side of science and you believe only in Darwinian evolution. Again, the man who discovered DNA is telling us that's not the way it works. He's telling us DNA is so complex that it has to be part of some sort of intelligent design. And the most fascinating discovery he made concerns the actual dust in our galaxy. If you were to simply release bacteria into space, they're going to give off a light signature. It's called a spectrographic signature. Well, he looked at the light signature of the dust that's already there in the galaxy from where we are on Earth to the center. And he found that the dust in the galaxy has the same spectrographic signature as living bacteria. In fact, 99.9% of all the dust in the galaxy has the same signature of light as living bacteria in space. That could mean that everywhere we look throughout the galaxy, we're seeing dust that is actually little critters that are alive. And the reason why is because that's what the galaxy is doing. So if you think about it, this is Howard Hughes' worst nightmare, that space could be filled with germs, as you see in this headline. Howard Hughes, of course, helped finance the Integratron, which is a device that was allegedly built with cooperation from extraterrestrials through George Van Tassel. We're going to get to that in a minute. That's part of why we're here filming in Joshua Tree to end this video. As you see in this headline from the mainstream media, in this case UK Daily Mail Online, it says the space dust that created human life has been found in another solar system. So this is another example of how the mainstream media is starting to trickle out this scientific evidence that suggests that bacteria could be just cranking out from the field itself everywhere. In other words, the field takes any given molecules in a certain area and spirals them together to make DNA. DNA is the product of the field. The field literally wants to make DNA because DNA is the wave that is inside energy throughout the entire creation as we know it. One of the ways you can look to see that this might be true is to simply study what happens when you fly things up into outer space and see if there are energetic changes. Well, of course, flying human beings up into outer space, before we get into things like plant seeds, you can look back to testimonies from various astronauts, and they report something called space euphoria, which is that when they go out into space, they have this phenomenal sense of uplifting communion with the universe, a sense of oneness, a sense of stillness, a sense that they are fundamentally unified with everything that there is. And now more recently, the Chinese have done studies where they have flown seeds of various plants up into space and then grown those seeds by a typical hydroponic process when they bring them back down to the Earth. Now granted, this has been done before with experiments from NASA, and they haven't seen anything that unusual. That was one of the complaints that someone gave me when they came up to me at one of my conferences. I would like to point out, though, that the NASA probes are typically made of aluminum, and we know that these torsion fields, as the Russians call them, the energy of consciousness itself, can to a large degree be shielded by aluminum and PVC plastic. So if you have PVC plastic over the windows and an aluminum capsule, then it could be that all these wonderful energetic benefits that happen when you go into outer space did not exist. Anyway, the Chinese must have found a way to build a probe that was not strictly aluminum and PVC plastic, because when they sent seeds up into space, there were some pretty phenomenal changes that resulted. Take a look at this next picture. What you see here is a pumpkin that was grown from a seed that was flown up into space. As you can see, it's absolutely enormous in size. This is not typical. In the next slide here, you see a bitter gao melon, as it's called. This, of course, again, is much, much larger than you would ever normally expect such a melon to be. What you're seeing here is hot peppers, which normally would only be about this long, 2.5 inches long at the most. And yet, when you see the ones that were grown in space, they are enormous in size. Of course, you may also be aware of Findhorn Gardens, which is a particular area in Europe in which the people that cultivate these gardens believe that they are working with the spiritual aspects of nature. And in so doing, they create plants and vegetation that are just as enormous as what you saw in these photographs. Again, the key is harnessing the consciousness field. So when we see that by simply flying seeds into space, that they grow much more substantially, that suggests that the energy that makes things alive is in even greater abundance when we go out into space. That might be why 99.9% of all the dust in the galaxy is fundamentally creating bacteria wherever and however it can. This brings us back to the idea that the source of all life can indeed be found in an energy wave. If you can imagine now a stream going down the side of the mountain, and you see rocks in the stream, ask yourself, how did the rocks get into the stream bed? Did the water naturally appear where rocks already were? Or could it be that when there are large rainstorms and sheets of water falling down the mountain, that they're unearthing rocks that would naturally be there on the mountainside, and the rocks roll in the water current and end up rolling into the bottom of the stream? So that when they get to the stream, it's because there is a pressure that pushed them there. Now think about how this relates to DNA for a minute. Think about the idea that there are molecules sitting around, and that there could be these torsion fields, as the Russians call them, that naturally grab up molecules and will intelligently assemble them into the pattern that the wave already has. We know that the basic spiral of DNA has as its fundamental signature all the basic aspects of the Fibonacci ratio, or what's called the golden mean, which is the ratio of the number 1 to the number 1.618. That growth spiral shows up throughout nature. You can see it in the shape of a nautilus shell. You can see it in the arrangement of a sunflower. You can see it in many of the different patterns and proportions within the human body. This suggests again that the Fibonacci ratio is the fundamental character of the wave, and that DNA is emerging from this wave that exists throughout all of space. Well, this becomes a much more advanced proposition when you look at the work that has been compiled by Dr. James Strick, who wrote a book with the Harvard University Press called Sparks of Life. In the book Sparks of Life, Dr. Strick exposes a major scientific conspiracy that was going on throughout the 19th century, where some scientists were arguing in favor of the Darwinian model, where life evolves through spontaneous random mutation. It just seems to show up on a given planet. You don't know how it got there, it just randomly appears. But remember now, in the 19th century, this conspiracy had not yet been resolved. This was a conspiracy in the sense that the Darwinians ended up smashing down evidence that went against their own model. There were others who were arguing for spontaneous generation, which is the idea that life will spontaneously arise from non-living material. And there were numerous experimental examples of spontaneous generation that were found. These are examples in which you have a hermetically sealed container, and all you have in it is non-living material. There's no way that life could have gotten inside, and yet life spontaneously appears inside this hermetically sealed chamber anyway, with nothing more than water and the most basic ingredients allowing it to come into being. So Louis Pasteur himself had cases where life originated from non-living material. Now, if you see on the side of a milk carton where it says pasteurized, that Pasteur in pasteurized is Louis Pasteur. He's the guy who was one of the main architects of this conspiracy because he suppressed his own data and the data of other credible scientists to force fit the Darwinian model into what the data was that we were seeing. So you cannot so easily dismiss this idea of spontaneous generation. There are distinct and real laboratory experiments that show you that this is in fact what was happening. What we've instead had happen is that history has been completely rewritten in favor of the Darwinian model of evolution. And in my opinion, that shouldn't have happened. Well, the best way to see evidence for yourself that this natural, spontaneous emergence of life can exist is in a paper with a very large, tongue-twisting name, Ultrastructural and Light Microscopy Analysis of Sapobians Formation and Growth in Vitro. This was performed by Professor Ignacio Ochoa Pacheco. What is he saying here? SAPA means sand packet, and bions mean light forms, literally life forms that appear initially as light, that emerge spontaneously in a given medium. If you look here, you can see the link on orgone.org where you can look up this study for yourself. In this next slide, what you see is dust and sand that has been sampled from the ocean and put inside a test tube, and then a little bit of surface scum grows on top of the test tube, which is then skimmed off and looked at under a microscope. You don't see anything remarkable in terms of structure in this photograph, because you're literally just seeing little globules that have appeared. The key in Pacheco's experiment was that you had to heat the sand to white-hot luminescence first. Once the sand was heated to a white-hot luminescence, and then you put it into a sterilized test tube with nothing but sterilized distilled water, and you kept a stopper on it, and it was all done inside a vacuum, so there was no possibility of life growing inside. Then what you do is you look at the skin, or what Pacheco calls the surfactant, that grew on top of the water. You skim that off, and you look at it under a microscope, because what you're looking for is to see if in fact little critters grew in a non-living environment. We'll take a look at this next image. What you're seeing here looks almost like a brain. You can clearly see there are two lobes, that they are basically bilaterally symmetrical, meaning that they look the same on both sides, and it clearly appears to be some form of living microorganism. This blows me away even more, because what you're seeing clearly looks like a leaf coming from a sea vegetable form of life. You can even zoom in closer to that leaf, as we do in this next picture, and now what you're seeing is complex cellular organization within the leaf itself. You can clearly see that this is a biological life form. In this next image, you see what looks like a red blood cell, very obviously biological. And what you see in this next image is something similar to a white blood cell, where it actually has what appears to be a mouth on the front. Clearly a living creature. Now finally, this takes the cake for me. What you're seeing here looks like a little spiny porcupine that floats around in the sea. Those little spines on his body form a defense system so that if somebody else tries to eat him, they can't. And if you look, you can see that he has a little mouth at the front, and that obviously seems to be where his head is. So this is a complex, multicellular organism that has emerged from nothing more than sterilized beach sand and distilled water, allowed to sit there for 5 days, have a little scum grow on top of the water, and analyze it under a microscope. Where did this little guy's DNA come from? How did he emerge in that test tube? Look, all I'm saying is something very simple and straightforward. The DNA that grew inside the nuclear reactor, the DNA that grew inside the volcano, the DNA that grew miles below the ocean floor, the DNA that survived for 10,000 years in a deep freeze inside the Antarctic ice, the DNA that grows in space, the 99.9% of all dust in the galaxy that has the spectrographic signature of bacteria, it all appeared from the field, which then takes the existing material around itself, in this case, the raw materials that you can find in beach sand, and the basic hydrogen and oxygen structure in water, and then intelligently spirals life into being. For me, this is a revolutionary discovery that is further in support of what Dr. Francis Crick was saying, that DNA could not have evolved by random chance. Well, if that hasn't blown you away, check this out. National Geographic published a study on February 15th, 2009, and it absolutely amazed me, because what they showed was the actual proof that identical creatures are appearing at the north and the south poles of our Earth and nowhere else. To be specific, this was called the International Census of Marine Life, and what they found in this census was that there were 235 identical species of creature that were found at the North and the South Pole, but nowhere else on Earth. Finding so many species inhabiting both poles startled the scientists, as National Geographic said. Among other species that were found on both poles included whales, worms, and crustaceans. Exactly where these species came from and how they ended up a world apart with comparatively warm oceans in between remains a mystery, the scientists said. And that's a direct quote from the article. So what they don't understand is that the field is creating these life forms. Some scientists actually tried to say that ships may have been taking in ballast, meaning water, to weigh them down at the North Pole, sailing to the South Pole, and then releasing the ballast, and that this is how the creatures went from pole to pole. Well, that was actually examined, and they found that there are no ships that are traveling that way that could account for this. What you're simply seeing is that the Earth has this energetic engine that's cranking out life forms at the poles by the same process, and those life forms only appear there and nowhere else. Well, if you look at this first picture, what you're seeing is called Limacina helicina. This is a creature that only appears at the pole, has a very unique and interesting structure. The bottom of it looks almost like it's a snail shell, but then the top of it appears to be some strange form of jellyfish. This next creature that you see here, again, only appears at the poles, has a very interesting, almost angelic look to it. The next creature here, again, looks like a crustacean, sort of like a shrimp, but you only see this creature appearing at the poles. And lastly, this guy very much looks like a shrimp, except you see he has these two huge arrows at the front of his face, obviously for some sort of defense to stab other creatures and have his own food supply. What we're seeing here is a really phenomenal effect, because you can look at the work of Pacheco and see little marine organisms growing inside that beach sand that was heated to 1,000 degrees Celsius. But now we look at the Earth itself, and when we look at the poles, we're finding creatures that emerge there but nowhere else. To me, this is a phenomenal proof that what we're dealing with is, in fact, a source field, a life-generating energy field that will naturally take biological material in a given area and arrange it in such a way as to create life forms based on a design template. A design template, by the way, that is intelligently made. Is this solar system change that we're dealing with in some way related to species evolution? Does this solar system change promote species evolution in some way? Could DNA originate and evolve by an outside energy source? We're already seeing the proof lining up for that to be possible. When we look at the study of Dr. John Kearns, we see further evidence that this evolution of species could be energetically promoted. When you take bacteria who are lactose intolerant and you drop them into a lactose-only environment, as Dr. John Kearns did, they do not die off from starvation as you might expect. Instead, they spontaneously evolve new mouth parts that allow them to digest the lactose. This means that a change in the environment actually stimulates evolution. Well, it's obvious that global warming is a change in our environment right now. It's too hot, it's too cold, there's too much water, there's not enough water, and these things keep happening over and over again. So is that change in our environment stimulating us to grow in some way? Well, we just saw now with bacteria that you can drop lactose-intolerant bacteria into lactose, and they spontaneously evolve into something else. We can also see the same effect as you saw with the lactose-intolerant bacteria digesting lactose by spontaneous evolution by looking at the Italian wall lizard. Over a 36-year period, the descendants of these original lizards spontaneously evolved in a very fascinating way. In 1971, 5 adult pairs of Podarcus sicula, or the Italian wall lizard, were moved from their home island in the South Adriatic Sea. Their home island, known as Pod Capisti, was a desert, and they survived by eating small insects. The new island they were moved to, called Pod Mercaru, was a lush vegetative tropical paradise, and the lizards adapted and became vegetarians eating plants. The scientists then returned 36 years later, after 1971 when it first happened, in the summer of 2004, 2005, and 2006. During this time, what they did is to capture the lizards and measure them for various bodily dimensions. This includes the size of the vent on their nose, or the snout vent length as it's called. This includes the dimensions, the size of the head, and of course the mass of their bodies. They took tail clips off of these lizards. They didn't kill them, but they just took clips off the edge of the tail and tested their DNA just to make sure that these lizards were in fact the descendants of the original 5 adult pairs that were brought there in 1971. And the DNA tests confirmed that they were the same lizards from the source population. Yet the scientists discovered that in only 36 years there were what they called quote-unquote striking differences in the size of the head, the shape of the head. The bite strength had gotten much stronger because it's a lot more difficult to bite through the fibrous material of plants than it is to bite through an insect's body. And they found, most significantly, new structures that had developed inside the digestive tract of these creatures after only 36 years. In fact, these cecal valves, as you see in this image, were never before reported for this species. This is a small pocket inside the digestive system that creates fermentation, which allows these plant matter to be digested properly. So you can see in this next image different types of lizards that are from the same species. And what you can see is noticeable changes in the size of the head. I show you this image just so that you can get a grasp on how big the head could become from a creature that already had a smaller head in the past. Again, this is a spontaneous evolution. It occurs over only 36 years of time, and we're seeing adaptive changes that allowed these insects to be able to eat plants. They also stopped the instinctive behavior of defending their territory. This is very interesting because it suggests that the vegetarian diet helps to reduce aggression. The behavior of the lizards actually changed when they no longer had to kill living things for their food. They stopped being so aggressive. So this is a really phenomenal study for me. You see this little guy and you wonder how in the world simply changing his environment could have made his biological nature change so much. Another example of the same type of effect was found with the humble lizard known as Anolis sagre, or what most of us would call the anole. You can actually buy these little guys as pets in the pet store. Well, what was found in this particular study, which you can see here in this mainstream media link, is that when a predator lizard was introduced to their environment, they first grew longer legs to be able to try to run away from the predator on land. The problem was that no matter how fast they ran, the predator lizard ran faster and still caught them. So then they had to jump up into the trees and run up into the trees where the lizards that were the predators could not go. This was much better equipped for lizards who had shorter limbs, because shorter limbs allow them to climb better, whereas longer limbs allow them to run faster. Sure enough, when they went up into the trees, their limbs spontaneously became shorter in just a very short length of time. The scientists do not understand how this could happen, but it's as if the environment itself stimulated them to change, just like you saw before with the Italian wall lizard. Now in this case, this ugly-looking fish is being called evolution on steroids. It's a monster fish that appeared in a river in the Congo that we've never seen before. And again, scientists are perplexed as to how this fish could have showed up so quickly in the fossil record, because it never existed before and it just emerges. Similar to the way that we're seeing how National Geographic showed 235 different types of life that only exist at the poles. It's showing us that the field is out there and the field is changing, and life is changing as a result. In this next mainstream media link, you're seeing that swimming orangutans are now being discovered. The problem is they didn't used to be able to do this. For whatever reason, no orangutan had ever been observed swimming before, and yet now they're not only taking to the water and swimming, they're also learning how to fish with spears, banging fish over the head or stabbing them with the spear and being able to catch that tasty meal as a result. This is new behavior that again suggests that evolution is occurring. So as we ask ourselves a very fundamental question, could a species be energetically transformed? We're now zeroing in on the core question of how this interplanetary climate change that was predicted from these readings in the 1950s, which we'll see a bit later, could indeed lead to biological evolution of you and me on Earth, something that in fact might already be happening right now. We now look at the work of Dr. Tizian Kanchezin, a Chinese scientist whose work has been picked up and analyzed by Russian scientists. What he found was a DNA transformation that was through nothing more than a wave itself. As you see in this diagram, you have number 4 being a duck and number 6 being a chicken. Of course, they're not anatomically correct. It's a very simple diagram. But what you're looking at is that the duck, number 4, is inside a pentagonal room, a 5-sided room. All the number 2s that you see in this diagram represent funnels in which air can pass through and also energy could pass through. Then, after the funnels, you see those orange lines which actually represent copper pipes that go from the funnel to the other room where the pregnant chicken is being held. Now, the pregnant chicken is very important because there's eggs that are developing inside the chicken's womb. What you see with number 3 is a microwave generator. Now, this was not a lethal dose of microwaves. He didn't kill the duck, but he did excite the duck's DNA with microwave energy. Now, what happened was really phenomenal because as the duck's DNA was being excited, those energy patterns went over into the room with the chicken. Now, let's look briefly at this image of a duck. You can see that the duck has a long beak, it has a long neck, it has large internal organs, and if you look down at the feet, you can clearly see that there's webbing between the toes. When we look at this picture of a chicken, you can see the chicken's beak is much shorter, you can see there's no webbing between the toes, and in fact the length of the neck is much shorter. Now, it was a synchronicity. It just so happened that I was looking for these pictures online, and when I found this picture of the chicken, it happened to be a chicken who was raising ducks. Now, of course, when the eggs hatched, they didn't look exactly like ducks, but what they did look like was really phenomenal. As you see in the next picture, there's webbing on the feet, and in fact they were called duck hens. The webbing grew on feet of eggs that were laid from a chicken. Chicken feet don't have webbing. Chicken feet are supposed to have naked toes. And as you look in this next image, you can clearly see that the head of the duck hen looks more like a duck than it does like a chicken. In fact, we have some very specific statistics we can look at here in which 500 eggs were zapped through the chicken. Of those 500 chicken eggs that were zapped, 480 of them actually hatched. 80% of the eggs that hatched had a flat duck-shaped head as they developed. 90% had a shift in the position of the eyes where the eye actually moved back on the skull to the position it normally would be on the head of a duck. And 25% of them actually had webbing that grew between the toes. This is phenomenal because what it shows is that the genetic material of the chicken was spontaneously rewritten inside the womb so that when those eggs laid, they became half duck, half chicken creatures. That completely bypasses traditional Darwinian models of evolution. So you see how it is totally possible to explain evolution that has occurred on the Earth as being existing more primitive species that are energetically rewritten into more complex forms of life later on. Well, we can also look to the work of Dr. Peter Garriev, who took this even a step further. And what he did is to take eggs that had been laid by a frog and then zap them with a laser light that had gone through eggs laid from a salamander. Now, a salamander is considered a more primitive form of life than a frog. One of the unique qualities of a salamander is that you can cut off one of his limbs and the limb will actually regrow. The salamander has the power of regeneration, whereas the frog does not. So in this sense, you could almost say that it dialed the DNA backwards in evolution a bit. Because what happened when you redirect laser light through a salamander's embryos into a frog egg is that the frog egg has a complete metamorphosis, and what comes out is a fully healthy salamander, not a frog. Now, this is a scientific revolution in the making because it suggests that you can have a complete transformation from one species to another within one generation. Your parent could be one creature, you lay the egg develops into a completely different creature, and the only thing that you need to make that transition possible is the actual wave information that rewrites the DNA. It's almost as if DNA is like a jigsaw puzzle that has more than one solution. And this really changes how we see life and how we see evolution. It could very well be the engine of evolution. For if, again, you look back to the fossil record, as I said before, Dr. James Rope and Dr. David Sepkoski, two paleontologists from the University of Chicago, analyzed marine fossils, over 3,600 different genres of life that emerged in the various layers of fossils from the ocean. What they found over and over again was that there was a 26 million year cycle in the way that life was evolving in the Earth. This 26 million year cycle goes back, as you can see here, some 250 million years into the past, and it includes the fall of the dinosaurs. So how could something like this be possible? How could all creatures on Earth be spontaneously changing in even intervals of time? Well, the scientists really don't know what to make of this. And it got even stranger when there was yet another cycle that was discovered by doctors Robert Mueller and Robert Rode, which in this case is 62 million years long, as you can see in this diagram. And this cycle goes all the way back to the original single-celled organisms found in our fossil record 542 million years ago. In nice, even intervals of 62 million years, the creatures on Earth spontaneously evolve from one form to another. And that, to me, is proof positive that what we're dealing with is galactic energy waves. Galactic energy waves are the only plausible explanation for how you could have even cycles of time. What I'm suggesting is that there are evenly spaced waves of energy in the galaxy, and that those waves of energy are moving away from the center at a nice steady speed. So if they're always the same length and they're moving at a steady speed, that means that the cycles that they will create will be equal in time. And in fact, we can actually look out at the galaxy and see that galactic bioenergy fields may indeed be responsible for causing this 62 million year and 26 million year evolutionary cycle. Now look at this. In this diagram, you see the redshift variations in the supercluster of galaxies known as Virgo. What do I mean by redshift variations? Redshift is a microwave frequency that is given off by all objects in the cosmos. Most scientists interpret redshift as being indicative of how far away something is. But Dr. William Tift upended this whole scientific orthodoxy by finding that within a single galaxy, redshift starts changing in even intervals. And those intervals look like layers in an onion, meaning that the highest redshift is at the center of the galaxy, and then in evenly spaced orbits away from the center, the microwave frequencies of light that all the stars are giving off have changes in their frequency that are very measurable. Now, you can see it in this image from the Virgo cluster, and you can also see it in this next image, which is taken from other areas in the Virgo cluster. Dr. Tift's studies have looked at hundreds and hundreds of galaxies. Between him and other graduate students who have investigated this, they have yet to find a single galaxy that does not have these striations within it, where you see varying microwave frequencies. I then direct your attention to the work of Dr. Harold Aspdin, a scientist who on his website, energyscience.co.uk, has fundamentally rewritten the basic laws of electromagnetism by going back to Maxwell's original equations and then extrapolating off of them. He shows you every step. It's straightforward. Any scientist can follow it. What's so interesting is that as he looked at Maxwell's equations, he found that this quantum medium, if you will, the background energy that all matter is made of, would have certain thicknesses, or densities as it also is called. These densities in turn can be calculated with equations that Dr. Aspdin has discovered and published freely on his website. You can crank out the microwave frequencies that each density in the quantum medium will give off. That means that even though you can't directly see these energies in the quantum medium, they give off light signatures. They give off microwave signatures. Well, this is what's so fascinating, because when Dr. Aspen went back and looked at Dr. William Tift's microwave frequencies of redshift that he found in galaxies, those frequencies in the little striations that you see in the galaxy, shaped like an onion, are identical to the variables that Dr. Aspen's equations cranked out. That means that we have a theoretical foundation that was built first that says that the quantum medium has different levels of density, different planes of existence, if you will, where the basic qualities of matter and energy might even change. And he found that they really do exist in these waves in the galaxy. So we already know that the waves are there. They have been observed in every galaxy that has ever been looked at, well over 200 of them so far. They have been calculated theoretically. We have the equations. And now we're seeing that our solar system is undergoing climate change, and that climate change seems to be due to this expanding ripple of energy that's coming into the solar system. Well, that expanding ripple of energy could be coming from a wave that emanates from the galactic center.